nobody stop what the Most High put together. We gon' see. In times. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, Yasharala stay on point. They lurking. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war. We the generation that's gon' get on one accord. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, Yasharala stay on point. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war.
They are all considered abominations. Now, I got a comment on my last video asking the question, how is it that African Americans could be Hebrews when we are literally a mixture of so many different cultures, so many different tribes, not just from West Africa, by the way, also from Central Africa. And even at some points, the transatlantic slave trade was geared towards Southern Africa at certain times. However, if you know anything about the transatlantic slave trade, the fact is that these groups were so immensely mixed up that it's like impossible that you can't have at least one of these Hebrew tribes, especially when I've just told you a number of Hebrew tribes, including the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Ashanti, and the Ga and the Ewes. Like these tribes, which I'm going to read to you, were specifically some of the most targeted in the slave trade. And the idea that you do not have at least one ancestor from one of these tribes and you are a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, where literally the people of the tribes were taken to multiple slave castles mixed in with different groups. There was no complete separation, like, oh, we're only keeping people from these tribes here. No, literally African, they completely mixed everyone up, put people on slave ships and sent them off. For that reason, again, I think it would be highly improbable for you to be a descendant from people who were taken in the transatlantic slave trade and not have Hebrew lineage. But of course, can I prove that? No, these are not things you can prove. It's just common sense to me when you look at the composition of the people who were sought after. So let's read more about that particular aspect with the diaspora. Now, it's important to emphasize that initially when the slave trade began, the Portuguese, again, who I have said, the same people who were expelled during the Spanish Inquisition, just a few years after the Inquisition, that's how soon it was. The people who had converted to Christianity, who were identified as being Sephardic Jews, just a few years after they were forcibly converted to Christianity, the slave trade begins. How is that a coincidence? Please explain to me. So just a few years after that conversion, you start having the Portuguese going out and looking for Africans who they're going to take to Europe. And initially, they were actually going out and looking for Africans themselves. They were actually doing the handiwork, but they realized very quickly that, oh, wow, we don't have the capacity to trap these people. We don't have the capacity to get these people, you know, particularly the terrain inside of Africa, the climate, the conditions, they were not the best people. They decided to actually go out and do that work. So for that they decided to do is to find African tribes who are willing to collaborate with them in order to trap other Africans, capture them, and basically sell them to them. Now, it's important to emphasize, some people say, oh, Africans sold Africans. Obviously, it's more complex than that. We have to remember at that particular time, this is prior to colonialism, there was not a unifying identity throughout all of Africa. It was not like, oh, you black men, I black man, oh, we were brothers. No, that was not the common feeling. Instead, people found their identity with their tribes, because everyone's, you know, pretty much black that they encountered. So there was no particular affinity for skin color. Also, just like different tribes will war against each other and have always warred against each other, that means that when you war against one tribe, you're probably going to take captives. And many times during the slave trade, they were selling the people who they took captive inside of different wars. They were selling them to the Europeans, starting off with the Portuguese. So that's important to emphasize, because you're going to see the Portuguese somehow be able to convince a number of tribes to participate in an international slave trade. What did they know about the slave trade? I'm sure they did not know the depth of it, but still a horrible act to participate in. So let's read some of the kingdoms what were participants in the transatlantic slave trade. Let's see if you recognize any of them. The Ashanti, the Fon of Dahomey, the Yoruba Empire of Oyo, were all solicited to supply slaves to the slave trade. Slavery was a common feature of most African societies, although not as dehumanizing as chattel slavery, as people enslaved still had rights. Initially, the pool of Africans were war captives, people from rival tribes, or people who were indebted. As demand and pressure from Europeans grew, raids and warfare would be specifically conducted to meet that demand. Thus, the system of slavery encouraged warfare to produce captives for trading and stimulated an increase in slavery in Africa. 90% of the enslaved were sent to forcibly work in the Caribbean and South America. Only 6% were sent to work in the United States. The Yoruba, Igbo, and Fon were among the most enslaved. Now, how interesting is that? The Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Fon were among the most enslaved, but let's remember the Yoruba, the Fon, the Oyo, of the Yoruba, the Fon, and the Ashanti, those are the same tribes that were collaborators with the slave trade. So let's let that sink in. Whenever the Africans were solicited to participate in the slave trade, they were Hebrews, Hebrew tribes that were solicited to participate. I'm sure not knowing the demented plan to conquer other people who have their same bloodline, but they agreed and they did participate. But these same groups, who were also early participants with the Europeans, also became victims of the same slave trade. So let's read. The Fon people of Dahomey made up the largest proportion of slaves sent to sugar plantations in the West Indies, particularly to Haiti and Trinidad. The Igbo were primarily taken to Barbados, Haiti, Jamaica, and the United States. In fact, I think I remember T.D. Jake saying he is something like 100% Igbo or something. From mid 1600s to 1830s, the United States brought a large number of Igbos to Virginia and Maryland for tobacco plantations. It has also been hypothesized that about 60% of all African Americans have at least one Igbo ancestor. The Ashanti also make up a significant number of enslaved Africans in the slave trade, particularly in Caribbean nations, namely Jamaica. Even today, Jamaican names given to children, Adrinka symbols used on houses, Anansi stories, and the dialect of Jamaican patois all have roots in the Ashanti. There was also an early wave of Akan Ashanti people brought to South Carolina in the 17th century by colonists from Barbados. Both Marcus Garvey and his wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, are of Ashanti descent. In addition, famed abolitionist Harriet Tubman was of Ashanti descent. Both Garvey and Tubman have been lauded as mogul figures by their followers. So interesting that two prominent leaders were also people who came from the Ashanti, two prominent leaders inside of the entire African experience, Harriet Tubman, Marcus Garvey, and Ashwood Garvey. So I want to also give you this chart right here that's going to just give you a breakdown, like where did the people who were at transatlantic slave trade, where can they be traced to? So you see a number of countries. Again, it's not just West Africa. You have the DR Congo, you have Angola, you have Guinea, Cameroon, Nigeria, Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Mauritania, and Senegal, Benin, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Sierra Leone. So Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania. I mean, obviously to a lesser extent on that side, but still people from all of these places. A lot of tribes, we can say, definitely are Hebrew. And please let me emphasize that these are the ones who we can look at and say that these people are Hebrew. I'm sure there are many more that are Hebrew that I just have not come across. And again, that's all for us to do, all of us who particularly are continental Africans who have that ability to get an oral history from your families in different places in the African continent, dig into your family history. That's the work we have to do. What are your traditions? Where is your origin story? Where do you come from? And what is your language? Like, what are your different customs? These are things that each of us have to dig in if we're going to figure it out. So I close off the book, and by the way, this is the end of the book, but I close off the book talking about the First Africa Baptist Church. I wanted to emphasize this, that there were pews, and many of you probably know this, but I'm just going to say it again. There were pews that were found inside of Savannah, Georgia, obviously in North America, and the pews had engraved into the wood Hebrew, Ethiopia, Amharic, Ge'ez, and ancient Aramaic. And I think that's very interesting, particularly the Amharic Ge'ez. A lot of people focus on the Hebrew and don't talk about the Amharic Ge'ez. Why was Ge'ez a language that would have been carried from West Africa all the way to the Americas? Well, that means that there was obviously a aspect of our origin story that goes to Ethiopia. So,
okay, so this is going to be a lesson, a short lesson. It's a history lesson. It's not a Bible lesson. So we're dealing with there was an area in Central Africa that was called the land of the Jews in the 1500s. And so we're just going to cover that. I'm going to give you some sources on it, and give you information that you can use. This is just all information to use that the Israelites were in Africa and that the Hebrews were in Africa and that a lot of them got taken. That's who the modern day descendants of the slaves that were taken from Africa, that's where they came from. This is one particular group of Jews that were in Africa, or Hebrews that were in Africa. There's Hebrews scattered throughout all of sub-Saharan Africa, not just here. But this is just one particular group that I want to touch on and give you historical references and historical sources to back that up. Okay? Because knowledge is power. So it was called Judea Orum Terra, which means land of the Jews in Latin. On the map that I'm going to show you later, from the 1500s where they have it listed, it's spelled out Ivdaeorvm instead of Judaeorum, and that's because in the 1500s there was no J. It was only there was no J in the English language. It was only I, and there was no U. It was V. Okay, so Judaeorum Terra is Latin for land of the Jews. In the 1500s, European and Arabic explorers documented an extensive area in Central Africa that was called the land of the Jews. It was also noted that large populations of Jews lived in certain quarters of neighboring kingdoms. In this short lesson, we will explore the origin of these Israelites and show scholarly proof of their existence. Okay, some key terms that I just want to clear up because this is, oftentimes you'll hear Israelites calling Ethiopians Cushites. You'll hear Bible scholars doing that, and you're calling modern day Ethiopians and Eritreans Cushites, and that's only half true because the Cush in the Bible, who was a son of Ham, he had an empire. They had an empire developed called the Empire of Cush. That empire wasn't located in what is modern day Ethiopia. It was located in northern Sudan, and its capital was Meroe. Okay. The people today who are Ethiopians and like Eritreans, they come from Sheba and Saba, which are also Sabians, and we're going to cover this. But they descend from Cush, but that's not Cush in the Old Testament and New Testament. When it's talking about Cush in Ethiopia, it's not talking about these Ethiopians, modern day Ethiopians. Okay, they were a separate people, similar people because they descend from Cush, which we're going to cover, but not the same exact people. So key terms here: Kingdom of Cush, also known as Meroe, located in Sudan, also called Ethiopia in the Bible, not located in modern Ethiopia. So now we're going to get into the origins of this land of the Jews, or this kingdom of Jews that existed in Central Africa around the 1500s. Okay. Origins. We have King Solomon and Queen Sheba, and we're going to read a little bit of this, but basically it is believed by Ethiopians that the Queen of Sheba, who the Ethiopians come from, they come from the kingdom of Sheba, modern day Ethiopians, the Amhara people. And there's lots of different groups in Africa, and a lot of times we make generalizations, and you'll just hear, Ethiopians Cushite, or the Ethiopian Sheba. There is multiple groups of people who live in Ethiopia, and not all of them descend from Sheba. Okay? Some of them descend from other groups, but the Amhara descend from Sheba. Okay, Cush had many children and many grandchildren. So other groups who are not a part of the Amhara, they wouldn't have descended from Sheba. They descended from other Cushitic descendants. Okay, so the Queen of Sheba that they teach, you can't find this in the Bible, but I'm not going to say, it could be true, could not be true. And the only reason why before I came fully, I'll give you a tidbit, because I used to really be into reggae, Rastafarian stuff growing up, and I've explained that before why that was when I was a Sunday Christian, and before I came into the truth as far as keeping God's commandments, keeping the Sabbath, and doing everything, and realizing that I'm an Israelite. And the reason why, I'll just tell you again, the reason why I was so into Ethiopia and the reggae stuff and looking at Rastafari stuff when I was a Sunday Christian was because I read the Bible myself as a child, and stuff didn't add up to me. I'm reading the Bible and I'm like, this stuff, the way they're describing the Israelites, I'm like, this seems like our people. But then when I would ask, elders in the church or people who's supposed to, teach me, they would be like, no, we're Hamites. We descend from Ham. We're not. And so what I ended up doing as a child, like in middle school, I was like, well, then this must apply to, then if we're Hamites, the same curses and the same covenant he made with the Israelites must apply to Ethiopia. That's what I did because I didn't have someone to properly teach me. I didn't realize that we were the Israelites. Okay. So anyways, I used to believe that like the whole story, Queen of Sheba did have a child with Solomon. Then once I came into the truth, I was like, I don't know about that. But now I'm back like it's 50-50. I don't know. We don't know. They claim they did. It could have happened. The reason why I say it could have happened is Solomon had a lot of wives, man. And there's no way we were going to list all of his children out of all the wives that he had. So, I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us that he married Sheba. And the legend story that the Ethiopians claim about the Queen of Sheba, and how Solomon ended up sleeping with her. You can't find that in the Bible, but it's in their Keber Nagath. So that's up to you. You can, whether you want to believe it or not. But what is evidently clear, whether she had a child with Solomon or not, there was definite ties between the Israelites and the kingdom of Sheba. Okay. So anyways, as the story goes, Solomon, when the Queen of Sheba came to visit King Solomon, she ended up having a child with him. One of the legends says that how Solomon did that was he told her like basically you'll have to grant me whatever I want. I'm paraphrasing and forgive me if someone who's Ethiopian knows this legend particularly better than me. I'm just going off of what I remember from reading the Keber Nagath and stuff like 20 years ago. So basically he told her not to ask, like you don't if you ask me for anything, then I'll get to have one wish or whatever or one thing from you. And the Queen of Sheba was like, well, I have all these riches, I would never need to ask you for anything. And so he made it like he put some water in the room that the Queen of Sheba was sleeping in, knowing that it was going to get really hot and that she was going to drink some of the water. And then she drank some of the water, and then that's when he, was like, okay, now I want to, be with you or whatever. That's one of the legends I read. I'm just saying it. Anyway, so either way, the story goes, then Queen of Sheba got pregnant and had a son. His name was Menelik. That son, Menelik, then when he became an adult, got sent back to Jerusalem and, to his father, King Solomon. King Solomon, coronates him king. Menelik changes his name to David after his grandfather. And then Menelik returns back to Ethiopia or Sheba. At the time, it was called the Kingdom of Sheba. But he returns back to modern day Ethiopia, where modern day Ethiopia is. And King Solomon sent like a colony of Israelites with Menelik to go back to settle in Ethiopia and to help teach the Ethiopians, modern day Ethiopia. At the time, it was Sheba, to go back and teach them how to keep the commandments and, follow the one and true God, the God of Israel. And so that's the first way that, they came in there. Okay. The second way is the Assyrian captivity. The Assyrian captivity is, after the Assyrians sacked the northern kingdom and took them captive, there were groups of Israelites who migrated later on, and they migrated into Africa and they migrated into Ethiopia. Okay. And what I'm saying, this is backed up, like the Falasha themselves, which is one of the names for the Ethiopian Jews. They verify this, and also the Ethiopians themselves today, they verify this as well. Then the next is after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, you had some migrate into Ethiopia, and then finally in 330 AD at the fall of Cush, or the fall of Meroe, more moved in. So I'm going to read this little part I have on here. According to Ethiopian records, a colony of Israelites left Israel during the 10th century BC and migrated to Ethiopia. Okay, that's what we were talking about, King Solomon and Queen Sheba. Records also indicate that some Israelites migrated as refugees from the Assyrian captivity to Ethiopia during the 7th century BC. That's what we covered with the Assyrian captivity. More joined them after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And I put it here in parentheses because I just wanted to cover this point. Others slowly migrated to West Africa via the Mediterranean/North Africa, or joined those in Meroe who migrated post the Babylonian ascendancy. And so what I'm talking about here is you had a group of Israelites who migrated into Sheba, or what is Ethiopia, after the fall of the temple. But then you also had during that time after the fall of the temple in 70 AD, there were some who went to West Africa via a long migration along the Mediterranean and North Africa and the Sahara. And then you also had some that went to Meroe. And when they got to Meroe, they joined the Israelites that were living in Meroe that had already migrated there after the Babylonian captivity. You can read in Jeremiah. It starts in Jeremiah with the first groups of people moving into Egypt after finding out that the Chaldeans or the Babylonians are about to come conquer them, and they moved into Egypt. But eventually, when the Egyptians, like when the Persians started conquering and the Greeks started conquering, a lot of the original ancient Egyptians, the Kemetic one, what we call Kemet, the black ones, the original inhabitants of Egypt, they migrated and left out of Egypt. They started leaving out once the Persians and the Greeks and stuff and the Romans started coming in, and they migrated into Africa as well. And you had the Israelites, or the Jews that were living in Egypt, who had fled to Egypt. They migrated too, and they went into Meroe, which is just one kingdom over into northern Sudan where Cush is. Okay. Now, lastly, after Axum destroyed Meroe or Cush, and remember, Axum is just an extension of Sheba. The kingdom of Sheba transitioned into being the kingdom of Axum. When Axum destroyed Cush in 330 AD, it is recorded that many Israelites migrated to Ethiopia. Others went to West Africa. So at that point, when Axum sacked Cush, you had a lot of Israelites leave Meroe and go west towards West Africa along the Sahel. A lot of them first settled along the Lake Chad region. And then from there, taking a sip of water. And then from there, they went into other parts of West Africa. But you also have some Israelites who went into Ethiopia and joined with the Falasha and the other Israelites who were there. And one of the main reasons, besides the fact that, okay, these people came in and conquered, you don't know how they're going to treat you, so you leave. Another reason was Axum had converted to Byzantine Christianity. And so they were going to try to force Byzantine Christianity on the Israelites. And, the Israelites weren't having it. Just like a lot of times our people migrated, the Israelites would migrate because Muslims were coming, trying to force them to be Muslim. Like other Hamite Africans, like the Fulani and stuff, were coming and trying to make the people Muslim through jihad, so they would migrate. Same thing here. These people were trying to force them to become Eastern Orthodox Christians, essentially. And so that was another reason why they migrated. Okay, so next we're going to cover from the 4th to the 16th century AD shortly, just to get you up to the point of where we're dealing with where this land of the Jews was actually located in Central Africa near the equator. And like I said, I'm going to show you the map after we get done with this, and I'm going to read to you from the source I have, and so that you can have the proof yourself. Okay, so after Axum destroyed Meroe and converted to Byzantine Christianity, the Israelites of Ethiopia fought them and established their own kingdom. This kingdom has been referred to as the kingdom of the Gideons, land of the Jews, and kingdom of the Falasha throughout the ages. And forgive me for the grammar mistakes. I was working on this. I didn't proofread it, but I was working on this late at night and early in the morning. So I'm going to read that again. The Israelites of Ethiopia fought them to establish their own kingdom. This kingdom has been referred to as the kingdom of the Gideons. So if you want to look this up, like the kingdom was sometimes called the kingdom of the Gideons. It was also called the land of the Jews and the kingdom of the Falasha. It's also been called the kingdom of Simeon for some mountains that are located in Ethiopia. And these were all different names that the kingdom had throughout the ages. And around the 10th century, a Jewish queen conquered Axum with help from the Cushitic Agwa people. After this, the Zagwe dynasty was established over Axum, with Agwa ruling. The Solomonic line from Axum/Sheba would not be restored until the 13th century. Because as we were talking about earlier, when Menelik came back, according to the Ethiopian tradition, he was king, and then his descendants all were kings from the line of King Solomon. A dart, though, for the Rastafarians and the people and the Jamaicans who are big on Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie didn't descend from King Solomon on his father's line. Like, not from his father's father. He descended from King Solomon from his father's grandmother. So, just learning something on your way to learning something. And that's if you believe the story about Queen Sheba and the King of Solomon having a child. Okay? So anyways, up until the 10th century, these Solomonic kings supposedly, when I say supposedly, I'm talking about them being of Solomonic origin. They ruled. We just don't know if it's true if they were from King Solomon or not. Could be, could not be. Doesn't really matter to me either way. Anyways, so in the 10th century, a Jewish queen conquered Axum with the help from the Cushitic Agwa people. After this, the Zagwa dynasty was established over Axum with the Agwa ruling. So they replaced the Solomonic dynasty. Okay, the Solomonic line from Axum/Sheba would not be restored until the 13th century. After this restoration and subsequent attacks, many Israelites migrated to Central Africa. So basically what happened was after the Solomonic line was restored, the Ethiopians, or at this time now their empire was being called Abyssinia too, they waged attacks on the Israelites or the Jews living there. And a lot of those Jews migrated into Central Africa. Okay, and that's where we're getting to what I'm about to show you next with the land of the Jews in Central Africa. Okay, there they formed their own state while others settled in neighboring kingdoms. Okay, I'm going to give you the sources for that and show you that too. Because basically you had them settling, these people ended up settling in what is now the northern portion of the Democratic Republic of Congo, parts of the Central African Republic, or I don't know if it's still the Central African Empire. I think it's the Central African Republic. Anyways, because it used to be the Central African Empire, but I think it's the Central African Republic now. Anyway, they settled in the southern portions of there, and then you also had groups in another kingdom. You had Jews who were living in the northern parts of Uganda, and they didn't live in their own kingdom. They were living in somebody else's kingdom. These people, they lived in another group's kingdom. But we're going to cover that as we read the source, as we read the sources for this. Okay. Where were we at on this slide? Let's read that again. After this restoration and subsequent attacks, many Israelites migrated to Central Africa. There they formed their own state while others settled in neighboring kingdoms. The transatlantic and Arab slave trade would both take slaves from this area. Hamites taking them from the interior and selling them to the Europeans or Arabs. And I'm going to pull up the map so you can see what I'm talking about when we get to that point, and we'll discuss that. But you had Hamites or other Africans selling these Jews to the Arabs and to the Europeans. And I'll show you that on the map. Okay. So now we're going to read from the source. And after that, we'll look at the maps, like the actual old map. And I'll give you all the sources you need to show you that there were Israelites living in Central Africa. We're talking about the northern parts of the Congo and the modern day Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and southern portions of modern day Central Africa and portions of northern Uganda. You had a large population of Jews living there in the 1500s, and this is well documented. And we know that slaves were taken from that region. Okay. So I'm going to be reading from the Jews of Africa, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, by Sidney Middleson, published 1920. And the copy that I'm reading from, is from, was published by the University of California. Okay. So I have it downloaded onto my computer, and I could have recorded the screen, but I didn't want to do that because this takes the book is so long, it takes a long time for individual pages to pop up. So you would have to wait 20-30 seconds while I'm waiting for it to materialize. and scrolling up and down it just wasn't conducive. So I decided to just do the screenshot route. Okay, so this is from page 5. And I'm getting to the point where what we want to talk about. Covering all the stuff that I've been talking about in this lesson. There are, however, several theories respecting the origin of the Jews in Abyssinia and Ethiopia. And Phalashas and Abyssinians alike have always believed and still believe in the Judaic origin of their individual races, while many authorities are of opinion that 3 separate migrations of Jews into Ethiopia actually took place. The 3 theories chronologically arranged are as follows. 1. That Menelik, son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, who had received his education in Palestine, went back to Abyssinia on the establishment of the Ethiopic Empire by his mother, bringing with him a large number of Jews, at a day somewhat anterior to that on which he ascended the Abyssinian throne, 986 BC. 2. That Sargon or Sennacherib, the successor of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria, having continued the war commenced by his predecessor, conquered the kingdom of Israel and brought the captive Jews and their king Hosea to his country circa 722 BC. And from thence they eventually found their way into Abyssinia and Ethiopia. You have Israelite camps that teach that that there were Israelites, they left Assyria and they sailed to the Americas, and that Native Americans are Israelites. That's not factual. You have here, this is factual. This can be proven. We know that people left from the Assyrian Empire, from the Assyrian captivity, and went into Africa. We also know that a lot of Assyrians, after the Chaldeans conquered them and Babylon conquered them, that a lot of them migrated into Africa. We have strong conclusive proof that the Assyrian, the Hassa people and some other people in West Africa and like Central Africa, like Chad and Niger, that they migrated from Assyria and descend from the ancient Assyrians. That's a lesson for another day. I think one of my videos, I put the source for that. Oh, the Igbo DNA test video. If you go in the description, I have links to where they talk about the Hassa descending from the Assyrians. Scholarly resources. Okay. Anyways, but the point is they didn't sell to the Americas. They won't tell you this, but a lot of that they borrow them camps, and I don't want to be disrespectful, but a lot of people call them ABC camps or whatever. They come from out of New York. They won't tell you this, but they get a lot of their stuff, i.e. like that they came to America from the Mormons. Mormons teach that the Israelites left and came here to the Americas after the Assyrian captivity. That's Mormon teaching. Also, I don't want to go into going into their doctrine. I'm just stating the fact that that's not possible. Reasons why that's not possible is even in Jesus' day, in the Gospels, you'll find that there was a woman who was a prophetess, and she was of the children of Asher. But they teach you that Asher, somehow the tribe of Asher made it over here to, I think that on their chart they call Asher Brazil, I think, or somehow they're over here in South America. How is that possible when there was a woman of Asher in Jesus' day in the Gospels? That you mean to tell me she sailed all the way from Brazil in the 1st century AD to Jerusalem? Come on now, that doesn't make any sense. Also, there's scriptures in the Bible that tell you that people from the northern kingdom returned to Judah, like Jerusalem, when Ezra and Nehemiah came back to rebuild the temple. It just doesn't add up with scripture. Anyways, the only reason why I'm pointing this out is because they teach here. We're reading the actual source where it says they migrated here to Ethiopia. They didn't leave and go to the Americas. Okay, and I don't have any bias or anything, as I always say, because my mother's mother's father was Choctaw, and you are what your father is. So that means my grandma on my mom's side was Choctaw because her father was Choctaw. And, I wish that was the case, that they were Israelites too, but they're not. And then on my dad's side, his mom, my grandma on that side, through her father's line, I have Cherokee. So I don't have any angst or anything I have Native American ancestry as well, just not through my paternal side. My paternal side is all pure Israelite. And my mom's paternal side is also all pure Israelite. Okay. Anyways, go on to the next page. Okay. Third, that after the destruction of Jerusalem by Vespasian in 70 AD, large numbers of Jews fled or drifted into Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and the neighboring territories. Some writers, and Kashgar said, drifted into Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and neighboring territories. Where would be neighboring territories of Ethiopia, where modern day Ethiopia is? Neighboring territories would be like Kenya, what's now South Sudan, Central African Republic, the northern Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania. These would be all places. Just showing you, like, this is from a European source, a European scholar, okay? And he's saying that this is where other scholars before him have said that they believe that these Ethiopian Jews came from. And he's telling you that they went to other places other than just Ethiopia, okay? And I'm pointing this out because, like I said, I've had people come on here before. I've had people, and I've done response videos. You Israelites are full of it and all kinds of derogatory stuff, and you're a liar and blah. And we're Kemet and the Jews weren't in Africa. I'm reading to you from sources. I don't come on here to make nothing up. I just come on here and read and explain to you what's being read. Okay. That's all I'm doing. So I don't know. You're not refuting me. You're actually making yourself just look foolish because the evidence is there. You either take it or leave it. Okay. And the only reason why our people don't know this stuff is because our people don't read. That's why they always say, if you want to hide something from a Negro, I'm not going to say what they really say, but if you want to hide something from a Negro, you put it in a book because black people don't read. Okay? And all I'm doing is just reading to you, giving you the information that's out there so that our people can learn about who they actually are, according to history and according to the Bible. Okay? Some writers state that the descendants of the earlier immigrants who were supposed to have accompanied Menelik treated the later arrivals as strangers, and that the latter practiced rites and observed festivals unknown to the earlier colonists, who, for example, had never heard of the minor festivals of Hanukkah or Purim or the Talmuds. If these statements are accepted, they provide some justification for the acceptance of the first theory with reference to their. And I'm going to pull up the next thing on the screenshot, but I just want to talk about this would have been the case because the first arrivals, there was no Purim yet because Purim happened with Esther, so they wouldn't know to keep Purim. Which, by the way, I do Purim personally, but the churches like the church I belong to, they don't, and my teachers, they don't. You can do it if you want to because it's not an actual commandment. That's not a commandment from God. It's in the Bible, but it's not a commandment from God to do Purim. It was something that Esther's uncle had them institute during the era of the Persians. You can go back and read the story of Esther and get more information on that. But when he set up that festival, because they were trying to kill, during that time, there was an Edomite who was trying to have all of the Israelites exterminated throughout the entire world, throughout the entire Persian kingdom. And his plans got foiled. This is all in the story of Esther. And at the end of when his plans got foiled, they set up Mordecai and Esther had a festival set up to celebrate that every year where you give gifts to the poor and all of that. And they said that the Jews should observe it. Nowhere in scripture does it say that God commanded you to observe it. Like in Leviticus 23 and throughout the Bible, God tells you to observe Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, which is Feast of Weeks, the memorial blowing of trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the feast yearly that you're commanded by God to observe in the Bible that most people who call themselves Christians don't observe. Instead you observe Easter, which is not in the Bible. But he's saying here that the original Jews that were living in Ethiopia, since they came in the 10th century BC, they didn't have any concept of Purim. They also didn't have any concept of the Talmud, which you don't even want to mess with the Talmud anyway. The Talmud is a satanic book filled with Edomite, which is fake Jews, traditions, and not anything to do with the Torah. It's not the Torah. It's not the commandments. It's a satanic book. You can look that up on your own. That's not the point of this lesson. And then the last one was Hanukkah. They wouldn't have celebrated Hanukkah either, like some of the later arrivals would have, because Hanukkah was not instituted until after the Maccabees. And the Maccabees came in the intertestamental period. Okay, next page from there. How far the account and the origin part on here, as you see at the top left, that's continued from the last page. Remember, I stopped before the last word because it wasn't on the same page. How far the account of the establishment of the empire of Ethiopia by the Queen of Sheba may be considered as historical, it is probably useless to discuss today. The Bible chronicles her visit to King Solomon, and all Abyssinia and Phoenician traditions agree as to its authenticity and affirm that Menelik, her son, and a son of King Solomon, succeeded her on the throne, while a list has been preserved of the kings of the race of Solomon, descended from the Queen of Saba, which is the Queen of Sheba. Indeed, it has been maintained that it is quite possible that the Queen of Sheba and her people professed the Jewish religion even before the reign of King Solomon, although Abyssinian annals state that the queen was formerly a pagan. So this Gentile scholar, that's why I say you have to pick out the bones. He's saying that it was possible. It might have been possible that the Abyssinians or Sheba, or what we call the modern day Ethiopians, were already practicing Judaism. No. The records from the Ethiopians themselves don't attest to that, as he says right here. It says Abyssinian annals state that the queen was formerly a pagan, but was converted to Judaism in Jerusalem. And tidbit, it's not Judaism. Judaism is a false religion that is invented, that the fake Jews who call themselves Edomites practice. That's based off of the Talmud. The people in the Old Testament didn't practice Judaism. You know what they practice? They practice keeping the commandments. That's what following God. The ones who did. You just do the commandments. Do what's outlined in the Torah. Do what God commanded you to do in the Bible. That's what they did. It's not a name. It's not called Judaism. And if you wanted to call it really anything, it would be actual true Christianity, because they were followers of Christ. Christ was the same. The Christ in the New Testament was the same God of the Old Testament. I always reiterate that. Paul told you that rock that they followed in the wilderness was Christ. Christ told you himself that no man has seen the Father, nor his shape, nor has heard him at any time. So who was Abraham and all them people in the Old Testament when they saw God? Abraham. And when Noah heard from God, and when Cain and Abel, when God walked amongst them, who was that? That was Christ. It tells you, and why do you think it's the Elohim for the Godhead? It's plural. Why do you think in Genesis it said, let us make man in our own image? Why in John chapter 1 it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God? This ain't complicated, bros. And I'm only saying this because there's Hebrews out there who kick against Christ and don't know, and then saying you got to know the name and speak Hebrew, and his name is Yahweh Shua, and then you pray to Yahweh. And dude, the Yahweh, whatever name you're coming up with for Yahweh was Christ. Okay, and I'm gonna do a lesson on that this week. Look for that. It's coming out in a few days. I'm doing a lesson on Hebrew and the name Yahweh, or Jehovah, because that's what it's transliterated to into English, was Christ. Like, that's not the Father. Jesus said he came in the name of the Father. So he came in his Father's name, not his own name. Okay? Anyways, that's just learning something on your way to learning something. So the people in the Old Testament who were truly believers in God and following him, they weren't practicing Judaism. They were practicing keeping the commandments of Christ. That's all. Okay? Where are we at here? Says, last part. She appears to have been a woman of learning, resource, and energy. And after she had established the empire of Ethiopia, she settled the succession in the family of Solomon, enacting that after her no woman should be capable of wearing the crown or being queen, but that it should descend to the heir male, however distant. In all probability, most of her own people, the Sabians, as well as a large number of the inhabitants of Abyssinia, adopted the tenets of Judaism, probably soon after her visit to King Solomon at Jerusalem. Okay? And I'm going to pull up the next one. Okay, from the previous pages, they ended with an event must have taken place somewhere about 1,000 years before the beginning of the Christian era. The Queen of Sheba died, apparently about the year 986 BC, and Menelik, her son, succeeded her in due course. According to Abyssinian tradition, the queen had sent her son to the Jewish king in order that his education should be completed, and Solomon did not neglect his charge. It was believed that Menelik was duly anointed and crowned king of Ethiopia in the temple of Jerusalem, and at his inauguration took the name David. He returned to Azab or Sheba, bringing with him a colony of Jews, among whom were doctors of law or judges and priests. All Abyssinia was thereupon converted, and the government of the church and state modeled according to what was then in use at Jerusalem. Okay, so now I'm skipping down to the bottom part of page 16, which deals with the ones in Central Africa in the 1500s. But whatever Basanaje may have thought or have written at the end of the 17th century, the position was differently regarded a century earlier. And what it's talking about, I don't have that part on here because it's not relevant to this, but there was another European explorer who in the 1600s, he had made this area where the land of the Jews were living at smaller and closer to Ethiopia than this one. But in the 1500s, it was a larger area. Okay, that's all that it's talking about. And the reason being, more than likely, is because they were taking them as slaves. They were taking our people as slaves. And so the population started to shrink over time. That's simple logic. Okay. Back to where we are. The position, no, we read that one. Sanuto, and I'm going to pull up his map at the end of this and show you what all this is talking about. Okay. Sanuto, the famous geographer of that period, whose African Atlas in Geography was published in 1588, shows a Jewish state distinctly marked as Judarium Terra in Tabula X of his African maps, the country extending some distance south of the equator and surrounded by mountains, a very considerable territory. So this European geographer in 1588 published a book with his maps. And on there, with his maps, he has a place in there that the Europeans, explorers, have found and heard of that was called the Land of the Jews. And it says it extended south of the equator. So this means that this was deep in Africa. And so that you get to normally find that, where do you find those? Near the equator. Okay? That's learning something on your way to learning something. The point that I'm making here is, so if these European explorers, okay, are finding that in the middle of Africa, near the equator, you have a vast area called the Land of the Jews, where many Jews live, and it's near the equator. And where were they taking slaves from? Tropical Africa. One of the places they were taking our people from. As far as the history goes, though, if you want to know who the so-called American Negro is, I'm presenting you the history. Some people will roll with history more than they'll roll with the Bible. All right, finishing this last part, it says John Pori, the English translator of the History and Description of Africa by Leo Africanus. So this guy, this English dude, and he did this in 1600 AD. He translated Leo Africanus, who was a Berber Arab from North Africa, who did a geography of Africa, and he translated it into English. This dude, John Pori. So it says here, John Pori, the English translator of the History and Description of Africa by Leo Africanus, writing at the commencement of the 17th century, contributed a chapter on the religions of Africa, in which he remarks, at this day also the Abyssinians affirm that upon Nilus towards the west there inhabiteth, and this is written in older English. Okay, that's all that, because languages change over time. That's why I'm doing that lesson on Hebrew, because I run across these Israelites and it's like, you gotta know Hebrew. You gotta know Hebrew. If you don't know the name, languages change over time repeatedly. So there's no way you're gonna have to I have to know it in this way. Like I said, I'm gonna cover that. I'm not knocking studying Hebrew, but I'm gonna cover how you don't have to know Hebrew to serve God. And you'll always notice with these people, they're more concerned about you learning Hebrew than keeping the commandments. That's all they care about. Hebrew. Instead of keeping it, even though Jesus didn't speak Hebrew, he spoke Aramaic. Even though the New Testament wasn't written in Hebrew, it was written in Greek. Even though every time the apostles in the New Testament, every time the apostles and the disciples quoted the Old Testament, they quoted the Septuagint, which was written in Greek. They didn't quote it written in Hebrew. I'm just saying that even though I know I'm going in right now, but still learning something on your way to learning something. And I'm going to cover this in the lesson. God created the languages at the Tower of Babel. What language were they speaking before the Tower of Babel? Can you tell me that? When everybody was speaking the same language? Remember? Because before the time, from Adam and Eve to Noah, they spoke the same language. Then from Noah to the time of Babel, they spoke the same language. When Noah called upon the name of God, when Abel called upon the name of God, when the saints who were alive during that time, when they called upon God, was it in Hebrew or what language was it in? Because we don't know what language that was. It was only one language spoken. Then if God wanted everybody to speak Hebrew, think about this. Learning something on your way to learning something. If God wanted everybody to speak Hebrew, why did he separate everybody at the Tower of Babel and give them the languages? God is the one who separated. Remember, if you read in Genesis, he's the one who confused their tongues and gave everybody different languages. If he wanted the whole earth to speak Hebrew, think about this. Use common sense. That's where I come, and I'm getting I know I get passionate, but so what? I get impassioned. I get passionate when it comes to the scriptures. This is why when the scripture that Paul talked about, don't let somebody deceive you, the simplicity of Christ. The simplicity. The Bible is simple. Is human beings get their hands on it and complicate stuff. It's not that complicated. So the point is why would God separate everybody at the Tower of Babel and give them all different languages if he wants the whole earth to serve him, but he only wants them to serve him in Hebrew? That makes no sense. None whatsoever. And how I got on this right now is because we're reading this, and it's in older English, because he's quoting this dude, John Porey, in this book. So you're reading this. This is why this is a high value source, because this is a secondary source, but he's giving you a primary. He's quoting a primary source. Okay. Multiple sources within one source. And the English is from the older English. So it's different than the English that we write and speak today, because languages change over time. It doesn't mean anything. Like right here, if you look on the page where it says affirm, and affirm has an E at the end of it, but we don't put E at the end of affirm anymore. Does that mean now that somehow affirm without the E is corrupted? Just like people say, because there was no J in the English before, there was no letter J in it. That came later. What? Anyways, learning something on your way to learning something, okay? Use common sense. All right. There inhabited a most populous nation of the Jewish stock under a mighty king. So you notice here that it's saying it was these were Jewish people, and it says a most populous nation, meaning that there was lots of Jews there and lots of people in this nation. And some of our modern cosmographers set down a province in those quarters, which they call the land of the Hebrews, placed as it were under the equinoctial, which is, that's just talking about the equator, in certain unknown mountains between the confines of Abbasia, which is Abyssinia, and Congo. So this is telling you that these Hebrews were found where? They were found between the kingdom of Congo and the Congo River, and between modern day Ethiopia. And I'm going to show you on the map where that is. There is no way getting confused in that area that's Negroes, okay? And that's deep in Africa. And when we show you on the map, you know that slaves were taken there, and we're going to take them from there. That's one of the primary places slaves were taken from, okay? And the European scholars and geographers are telling you in the 16th and 17th centuries that there was a land populated with a lot of Hebrews there, okay? So I'm going to read that little part again. And some of our modern cosmographers set down a province in those quarters, which they call the land of the Hebrews, placed as it were under the equinoctial in certain unknown mountains between the confines of Abbasia and Congo. And likewise on the north part of the kingdom of Goyam and the southerly quarter of the kingdom of Gorhan, there are certain mountains peopled with Jews who there maintain themselves free and absolute through the inaccessible situations of the same. So what he's telling you here is that in these two kingdoms, these other two kingdoms that are nearby, and I'm going to show you on the map coming up too, because I have a copy of the map, the Tabula X map from Livio Sanuto from 1588, documenting this, that you had Jews living in those two kingdoms who is saying, what it's saying here when they couldn't, inaccessible situations, it's talking about that they lived in that kingdom, but they were permitted to do as they pleased because it was hard for the rulers of that kingdom to get there. So it's like they may have paid tribute, but they were pretty much autonomous, okay? But always remember, when you read about them capturing slaves, where did they always go and capture slaves from? The interior. So even in these kingdoms, if they were selling slaves, they would be trying to go here where the Jews were to capture them, to sell them to the Arabs, okay? Or to the Europeans, okay? Where are we at? Last part here. Pori would thus appear to have been of the opinion that there was a Jewish state in the region indicated by Sanuto, as well as other territories under Jewish rule in the vicinity of the Abyssinian kingdom. Okay, this is the same page, but with the screenshot, I have to skip down a little bit more. So it has portions of the previous page on it. And this is the last page before we get into the map. Sanuto's references to the Terra de Judea are solely of a geographical character and the position in which he locates the country of the Jews on the African Tabula X. So when he says here Terra de Judea, that's just territory of the Jews or land of the Jews, and that's coming from Leo. That's where Leo Africanus also, he had called it the land of the Jews, and that's what he used, and that's coming from that map. Where are we at? Locates the country of the Jews on the African Tabula X is southwest and near the equator. He makes it adjoin the ancient kingdom of Benin, which is placed to the west of the Jewish territory on his map, some 30 years before. I'm not going to go to the next page, so we're stopping here. But it's letting you know that this kingdom abutted the kingdom of Benin, okay? And there was a lot of slave trading going out of the kingdom of Benin, okay? Where would and this kingdom this area abuts there. Where did they go get their slaves from? The interior. So now let's take a look at the map. And I hope you're getting a lot of knowledge out of this. And for my Israelites out there trying to learn about who you are, I hope you're getting a lot of knowledge out of it. Okay, so here's the map. And I just have it up as a screenshot. This is the map from Livio Sanuto's, from 1588, his Geography of Africa, Tabula X. And where I have it circled, I don't know if you can see it's close. If you look in there, in between that circle of mountains, it has Judarium Terra. But remember, as we discussed earlier, they didn't have the letter J back then, so it's I, and they didn't have U, so it's V, okay? But if you look up that term, even if you Google it, it's going to tell you that it means Jews, okay? Because they even use that in a Catholic term to refer to Jesus as the King of the Jews. And so it'll have Jesus' name, and then it has that referring to the Jews. So anyways, if you look here on the map, you see that line going across the middle of the map? That's the equator. And you see where this land of the Jews is located, okay? If you look where I have circled outside of the mountains, in that little southwest corner, the little lower right corner of the circle that I have highlighted, that's where they were located in those other. Remember, it said there was 2 other kingdoms where they were located in accessible regions, and one of them, it was the northern quarter of that area of Gorium. I have that that's what's circled in the lower right part of the circle to give you an idea of where these places are, where these were located. Okay, and if you look to the left of the circle, you can see Benin. So you get an idea. Like, this is where they would be taking slaves from. Like, this is all recorded in history. This is recorded. You knew that they go into the interior. That's where they pulled the slaves from. If you look here where it's circled, that is clearly the interior. Okay? So I'm going to leave this up for maybe about another 20, 30 seconds so you can look at it. And then I'm going to bring up a modern day map of Africa from Google Maps, a screenshot. And I'm also going to have this area circled on that map so you can see where this land of the Jews or this land of the Hebrews was located, where it's located today, where they said there was a huge population of Hebrews there. Okay? But if you look there today, is there a large population of Hebrews there today? Not really. There's still some over there, but there's not a lot. Why? Because they removed us and scattered us throughout the world and sent us into slavery via the transatlantic slave trade and the Arab slave trade. And the reason why we include both here, because if you look at this map, you can easily tell that Hamites from East Africa could easily go in there and get slaves and trade them to the Arabs to be sold to the Middle East or like Somalia or, Asia. And then you can also see how people from Hamites from the western part of Africa could go into the interior and capture them and then sell them to the Europeans. So they were going to get pillaged from both sides at this location. Okay. And I'm going to put a link on here for, the link will be in the sources if you want to pull this map up yourself. Okay, so hopefully as you can see this map, but this is a screenshot from Google Maps, so showing you Africa today. And I have the area circled where these slaves, where these Jews, eventually they would be slaves, where these Jews were living, where these Hebrews were living. So you see, it covered the northern portion of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It covered the southeastern portion of the Central African Republic, covered a little bit of South Sudan, and it covered the northwest portion of Uganda. And if you look on the left and the right of the circled area, and if you look, like I said, the left or the right, so the west and to the east, you can see, like you got to the west, you have Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Nigeria. You look to the east, you got the rest of Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. Okay? This is where they were taking slaves from. So remember, the slaves were being shipped off from the coast, but the slaves were being gathered from the interior, from far into the interior. So this would have been one of the areas that slaves would have been gathered from and sold, okay, to Europe or to the Arabs. All right, so I'm going to leave this up for a little second. And the last slide will just be the sources so that you can document all this yourself. And I'll leave that slide up for 30 seconds. And yeah, I hope you learned and I hope you were blessed by this lesson. Shalom.
In his hand, destruction gotta come, that's how he get us out this lane. The devil working hard, trying to get us out his plane. His sheep hear his voice, so he can't get us out his hand. We gon' trust the Son of Man, blow your winds, Father. Your kingdom coming, we just trying to make it in, Father. Rather we